Whenever someone wants to seem like a video game pseudo-academic, they'll eventually bring up Mario, or Mario, which is my favourite type of cereal. The little red plumber tends to always bring out the worst in people who are trying to seem smart. They tend to go into the over-analysing mode where they do things like this.
Therefore, Level 1's design doesn't just teach us how to play Mario. It imparts the essence of Mario. It's a statement. I am Mario. I am here. Ludo narrative. Dissonance. Flow state. Developers!
However, Marios, despite being low and fat, tend to have the subtlety of Banksy when teaching the player new ideas. So Marios are a very surface level candidate for discussion around design. So let's go one level deeper and look at a game which I think has a bit more depth when it comes to creating levels. That game is Bloodborne, and the level I'm going to look at for this video is just in general the forest area. Bloodborne's forest area follows three principles, which I think almost always encapsulate a good level. These principles are bending, theming, and learning. These three principles are present throughout the majority of Bloodborne and the Soul series as a whole, but Bloodborne, in my opinion, is the best one. Because unlike Demon Souls, which comes at a close second, Bloodborne has more polygons to work with. This is a big deal later on, so tuck that away and we'll come back to that later. Now before I go into the forest level, I need to ask and hopefully answer a question. What is Bloodborne's overarching feeling? Well, in my opinion, this can largely be attributed to how the game explores fear. Fear in games usually means jump scares and spooky ghosts. But Bloodborne explores fear not in the literal context, but in the literary context. As I'm sure you're all aware, Bloodborne takes its inspiration from eldritch horror, and all of the mystery and forbidden knowledge that brings with it. In fact, one of my mates, AGR Cactus, shown here, postulated the idea that the loading screens absent in the original build were intentionally left out to hide the game's secrets. But to go a little further into that, I think we're going to have to do a quick examination of the father of eldritch horror, H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was xenophobic. Now this is usually the bit where someone says something like this.
But that was just an unfortunate aspect of Lovecraft, and his works are not a reflection of that.
Cosmic indifference. This is a term Lovecraft used to describe the idea of his writing. Creatures older than humanity that have a denied awareness of culture. Something or someone that science has no way of measuring. Fear of the unknown. Being denied the existence of culture, or let alone existence, is one of the most frightening things some could imagine. But I would argue that it isn't a frightening thought, but a frightening reality. These ideas are deeply rooted in xenophobia, but not how Lovecraft engaged in it, but those who actually experienced it. And I think Lovecraft's work kind of unintentionally captures this. So one of the eldritch themes in Lovecraft's work could be the idea of being lost, that is, a lost identity, culture, and people. To Lovecraft's eldritch creatures, these things aren't even important enough to even be considered worth preserving. From Cthulhu's omnipotence, to the Deep One's quiet infiltration of the human race, the human protagonists usually don't have a say in this. That's one of the parts which to me really encapsulates eldritch horror. So what does this have to do with Bloodborne, and in particular the forest area? Well, Bloodborne's forest is about being lost. Not necessarily in the identity or cultural way, but in the feeling of anxiety that this can elicit. And it does this with level design and gameplay. So to explain that, I'm going to need to explain the first principle, bending. Bending is what Bloodborne does when you arrive at the forest area. By this I mean it bends everything you've experienced up until this point. The lush, open pine and mossy tombstones are a breath of fresh air to the narrow and smoggy, coffin-filled streets of Yharnam. But on top of this visual change, Bloodborne also bends the rules. Note the word bend and not break. Bloodborne never breaks a rule before teaching you. In the streets of Yharnam, you slink in and out of the fog, picking off enemies one by one. But in the forest, you're in an open area and enemies can easily surround you.
Looks like the shoe's on the other foot.
And if you are surrounded, then the old walk back or sneak up on the Beastie Boys to get some cheap hits in doesn't work. So that's what bending is. It's bending ideas. So once you arrive at the forest and the rules of the game have changed, this brings around principle 2, theming. Oftentimes when people talk about theming, they mean it in the way of English literature, and oftentimes poorly try to examine the themes of a game's story rather than the game's substance. In my opinion, themes are best explored through two ways. One being levels, and the other being something I'm going to save for another video. But in the context of how a level should explore themes, is that of a build-up. Levels should begin with an introduction and end with a climax or answer to the theme. This video is cheating because the forest has heaps of levels which build up to a conclusion. But more importantly, Bloodborne has the polygons to build this theme up of being lost into the level design and gameplay. First, let's look at the tombstones and amygdala stones. They appear more frequently the further you get into the forest. These are actually one of the most important parts of the forest because the repetition of these objects throughout the level actually means that you have nothing really to use as a landmark for navigation, because these objects begin to blend into the environment. Let's look at the second most important part, these snaky boys, and the fact that when you kill them they don't ragdoll, they disappear. Because of this, you're much more likely to lose your way because there's not a line of dead things back to safety. Shortcuts are part of just about every Bloodborne level. But the important thing to note here is the shortcuts in the forest aren't physical ones you need to activate. The shortcuts in the forest come from the opposite of being lost, knowing your environment. So when you begin the forest area, you begin with becoming lost, to the ending to where you're either stumbling across Byrgenwerth or rediscovering Byrgenwerth. So finally, we're going to look at learning. Now, if a level's doing the first two principles, then learning tends to happen on its own, because if you're bending the rules, then you're also inexplicitly creating new ones. And if you're establishing a theme for gameplay, then you're also establishing a new way for players to react to things that look similar. Learning in Bloodborne's forest comes in so many ways. So when you walk across this bridge and trigger this trap, it's sort of a joke because it swings off and hits you in the face, but straight away you know the forest has traps, so you have to watch your step. When you're just about to reach Byrgenwerth, you encounter the Flymen, who give you a status effect which you shouldn't have encountered up until this point. If you do end up becoming frenzied and die, you're only likely to be a couple of minutes away from the last lamppost. And this is actually used later in the Nightmare Frontier to create tension from when you just start getting randomly afflicted by this again. Fucking hell, this is great. Like, everyone always talks about games being art and shit, but like, this moment when you realise the character's about to go insane, which in Bloodborne is represented by your head exploding, even though it's a meter, you know the stakes, and that's why it's scary. So Bloodborne's learning is quite subtle. Remember at the start of this video when I talked about Mario's, you know, my favourite cereal? Well, Mario's biggest giveaway is its coins. These pretty much signpost everything. Now this isn't a bad thing because Mario is, let's face it, a game for kids. But Bloodborne is a game which weaves this into just about everything, which is why I think it's a better example than Mario. So to recap, Bloodborne has 3 principles which it follows through the entire length, and these can be applied to other good levels as well. 1. Bending. Bending the rules, environment, and gameplay of what the player knows. So in the forest, that's the visual tone, enemy type, and general playstyle. 2 is theming. So good levels start with a theme and then apply it to the gameplay and level design, and then it builds on this. The forest is about being lost, so every decision is designed to disorient and distract the player until they eventually stumble across Byrgenwerth, or they're so familiar with the forest that they end up coming across it. And then there's learning. As I said, if the first 2 principles are followed, this usually happens on its own. The forest sets up important gameplay elements which culminate later. So, there you have it. That's one of the reasons I think Bloodborne is actually Miyazaki's magnum opus, but also a really good example of game design. Video essays, mate. We're doing this now, are we? Where are all the cartoons, mate? I didn't subscribe for this shit. Yeah, so to explain that, I'm going to have to just talk about the stage where I'm at creatively. I'm making games at the moment, and I'd rather use my time like drawing and animating and stuff, going into sort of like original ideas and content and things like that. And the other question I had was, what have I done with Mr. Beatongue's corpse, and why did
This is just impossible. I get to the very end, yeah. God damn. And tell these dickheads in the embassy to just give me simple sentences. I mean, I've said this before. And tell that bloody interpreter. This fucking language. He just complicates it.